Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents the year's best dark fantasy and horror, Volume 1. Edited by Paula Garan. Narrated by Joe Hempel. Introduction. Strange Days. Fiction reveals truths that reality obscures. Jessamine West. These are unsettling times. The world changed forever as I compiled this anthology, and we don't yet know what it has changed into. Why, some must be asking, would anyone want to read dark fantasy or horror while a pandemic rages? The economy, and who knows what else, topples, and people are dying and suffering. I won't attempt to provide any deep thoughts on the subject, but I do have some shallow ones that occurred to me during the process of deciding the content of this anthology. Most of these stories begin with a world you can identify with, or the fictional universe is an extension of ours. You are grounded. Then things become disquieting, unnerving, disrupted, intruded upon. The world changes. The normal is subverted, but cleverness, or resilience, or caring, or perseverance still somehow exists. And if doom is inevitable, perhaps we emerge resolved to defy the fictional fate if it ever turns real. At the very least, we can admire those who have faced catastrophe. For better or worse, these stories will affect you, make you feel something that reminds you of your own humanity and that of others. To quote author Ruthanna Emrys, horror as a genre is built around one truth, that the world is full of fearful things. But the best horror tells us more. It tells us how to live with being afraid. It tells us how to distinguish real evil from harmless shadows. It tells us how to fight back. It tells us that we can fight the worst evils, whether or not we all survive them, and how to be worthy of having our tales told afterward. Dark fantasy? Well, I still will not try to define it, but as China Miéville has pointed out about the genre as a whole, traditional fantasy may only, as Tolkien wrote, offer consolation, but in the best of modern fantasy, things are gritty and tricky just as in real life. This is fantasy not as comfort food, but as challenge. Dark fiction isn't escapist. It confronts reality and helps us comprehend it. I didn't pick these stories with any theme in mind, certainly not to challenge or provide hope in these days of adversity. Response is always personal, but I think there's a chance you may find a modicum of such in some of these stories. After 10 volumes of the series with Prime Books, this is the first volume with a new publisher, Pyre. I'm grateful to both and hope the year's best dark fiction and horror series has a robust future in the ever-changing world of publishing. And thanks to you readers, new and old, you, more than anyone or anything, determine its future. National Burrito Day 2020, Paula Garan. The Fourth Trimester is the Strangest, by Rebecca Campbell. For hours now, the woman across the hall had been screaming. 10 minutes apart. 8 minutes. 5. And then the long, lonely push through to daylight and silence. And they said nothing about what had happened after that. A child, Jenny hoped. But maybe no child. She could only be sure of the screaming. A needle in Jenny's wrist dripped magnesium sulfate, which dropped a film between her and the world, as if the light that flooded the hospital room was beyond her, and she knocked against it in her permanent twilight. She only noticed the other woman's screams when she was through her own ordeal, though Greg said it had been going on all along, during the hours when she, turning inward, had drawn her mind deep into her guts and to Max, and had held on to Greg's hand and pulled him down toward them too. She had heard nothing but her own breathing in the knocking dark of her body, and Max, who made his dark water journey out. Before the screaming, hers or the woman's across the hall. They told her, curve around your belly, your knees drawn up, your back exposed, and push each vertebra outward. The nurse held her tightly. The anesthesiologist injected a local anesthetic between the second and third lumbar vertebrae before inserting a needle and threading a thin filament between the bones into the interior of her nervous system, the epidural space where sensation and thought run. She asked them, "What is that? What's the knocking?" She felt it inside the column of her spine, a shudder with each tap. The anesthesiologist said, "Knocking? Never heard anyone say that." The knocking ceased. The needle was withdrawn and the filament taped in place at what became later the meridian of her experience, below which her body was disobedient and strange to her, constituted not of muscle but of clay, so her legs might have belonged to someone else, maybe to the woman screaming across the hall. They arranged her on bean bags and pillows, maneuvered her like a marionette. Max's head pressed against her right hip bone, delaying his entrance into the world, and in the meantime Greg listened to the swish, swish of his heartbeat through the electrodes taped to her stomach. He watched her absorb fentanyl via her spinal column, while out of her sight a machine recorded events in that other realm below her navel, confirming her labor, which her body undertook despite the filamentary intervention in her spine. When he crowned, she felt no pain, just the trickle of blood, and knew that somewhere on the other side of fentanyl's meridian she was torn. "Stop pushing, madam," the doctor said. She obeyed, Max halfway into the world, the ceiling-mounted theater lights illuminating his entrance so bright she couldn't look at them or the crowd of nurses observing. "Now you may push, madam," the doctor said. And Max was out in a rush and a gush, and the doctor upheld a squalling, shining creature, shocked with hair, and she couldn't tell if that was his face or the back of his head, his little arms and legs stretching for the first time into air, and appalled by what they encountered, by variations in texture and temperature that hadn't existed in that other realm, and she ached with love for him and his confusion. The doctor set him on her belly as the placenta slithered out like Max's malformed twin. She reached toward him with one hand to say, "You are not alone," and the doctor stopped her, saying, "Do not touch, madam." She obeyed, and could only look at his little reaching hand. 36 hours after the doctor called her madam and slit her open to let Max out, she was on the couch, with Max's head pressed up under her chin and her arms wrapped around him. The tenderness inside approached pain, an open wound that would remain open forever and ever, her heart born outside her body. He slept rising and falling with her chest, as though she was his ocean and he, little innocent, on the raft of his life, pushed out into the unknown, no longer contained by the universe of her body but resting upon it, so she fancied she was any number of things, the world turtle or the ocean, the ash tree or the slope of Parnassus. Upstairs Greg was working. She could hear the creak as the two of them paced, the rattle of a door, sometimes the drone of a conference call, Greg's uninflected, professional voice in long discourse. Sometimes she heard them come down the stairs, pausing on the landing to check the scene below. She would speak, but Max startled when she spoke, so better to retreat into silence, which was nevertheless communication of a deep and bodily sort, as she listened for the tick of his heart. Little alien, better suited to that other universe in the dark and the waters, the nutshell world. "Jenny," a whisper on the stairs. Max was okay, though, so they didn't need to be concerned. When she looked up at the two of them, she discovered her eyes were closed. "We're good. Sorry I woke you." "No, I was awake." "I don't think so." She opened her eyes. The light changed. Afternoon progressed. "Oh, I didn't know." "It's okay. Text if you need anything." For a moment her eyes were open, she was pretty sure. Then she blinked and Max stirred awake on her chest with a thin cry like a kitten. "Am I asleep?" But Greg was gone. "Jenny." "What?" "Jenny." What? You need to wake up." She felt Max's warm imprint beside her. He'd gone, though, under the duvet. She felt briefly the curve of his back and his strong little legs, but then he slipped further away and he'd be lost in the pillows and sheets, and that was against government regulations regarding infant sleep safety. Listen to me, Jenny. Her eyes were definitely open because they ranged around the room. Greg standing over the bed, Max's cot, the window a mirror this early in the morning. I'm awake. Okay, but you need to wake up. He's in here, she explained, but maybe not out loud. She began unbuttoning the duvet where he'd crept inside, careful not to move too quickly and hurt him. But that couldn't be because he was only 3 days old. Or was it 4? Was it Tuesday? She didn't know. He was so small he might be lost in the bedding. And then what? I've got Max, Jenny. Oh, she said, and looking up, she saw that it was true. Max was sleeping in Greg's arms. Oh, she said again, as under her hands the fugitive Max disappeared. It was night, the velvety summer kind. So dark it was hard to think of more than Max and their dual heartbeats. Sometimes she slept. She thought maybe she slept, and mostly she didn't. They sat outside on the porch together, and Greg was saying something. He finished. Okay? Okay, she said, though she wasn't sure what she'd agreed to. Something about the public health nurse she'd met with earlier in the pregnancy, about the SSRIs and PPD and things, the annoying one who always called her Hun, because Jenny suspected the woman couldn't remember her name. She knew that Greg had been reading since the first trimester, and she had seen the search terms postpartum psychosis among them, which she tried not to take personally. He liked to plan ahead for all possible outcomes. Because, he responded, it's not anyone's fault. It's medical, not moral. She had, in morose fits during the weeks before labor, searched similar terms and discovered unpleasant truths regarding the damage mothers can do to their children. Women who fall asleep with their newborns and smother them, hamsters who eat their young, kangaroos who throw their joeys out behind them to distract predators. While they sat, the sky darkened but for the strip of dandelion yellow in the west, and between the sunset and the streetlights, there came the brief hour of fireflies darting in and out of green-gold luminescence. Also mosquitoes. West Nile, Greg said in the drowsy hour, Max asleep in his arms. We should get him inside. Greg was a good father. At twilight he often took Max, and she was supposed to have time to herself. But when he wept, her throat swelled shut and it was hard to think. But nevertheless, Greg always said, you should go for a walk. So even though her feet were still so swollen she had to wear men's Crocs, she walked their block to the busier local street with the stores and coffee shops, like some nocturnal animal dazzled by sunset. Sorry, she said, for blocking the sidewalk while around her strode determined students talking on cell phones and carrying takeout, in their clean clothes, their hair brushed, probably their legs didn't feel loose in their hip sockets, nor their belly skin flaccid and voluminous. Halfway to the next corner she passed a baby in a carriage and heard its sleepy evening cry, which triggered the first trickle of foremilk, soaking her t-shirt and running down toward her navel. She turned around and thought of all the undone laundry, how she would wash away the honeyish scent Max left on his clothes, which made her cry if she smelled it, and he wasn't in the room. The part of her mind that still sort of functioned told her it was super weird that she could miss him when he was in the other room, sleeping on Greg's stomach. The first time she left him behind to do something, a follow-up visit to her OBGYN to inspect the long tear, she had sat on the bus, her eyes leaking tears at the thought of those hours lost, when Max might have slept in the crook of her arm and she stared at darkness, the pre-birth substance, the shared ilum of their 4th trimester together. But there was laundry, which meant the basement she had never liked, the concrete pad for the washer and dryer and the rest of it just gravel and dust, and the tracks of animals, maybe the delicate bones of a rat. She heard them pacing together overhead, worried footsteps as they walked Max. She glanced up at the sound toward the half-open doorway at the top of the old stairs and thought, if it closed, how would I get out? Down here in the deeper dark, the before-time dark of a sleep so dense and heavy she thought she might be dreaming, and this could be the moment before she lurched into wakefulness and found herself not in the basement, but in bed. And this dark, the dark behind her own eyelids. The door creaked and swung, until only a thread of light remained. Max's first doctor's appointment, day 12. Getting out the door a disaster. Max crying, inconsolable. She stood in the middle of the living room, trying to remember what she didn't have. But how could she think when the sound of his voice wrenched her mind until she couldn't think? It's okay. Just a minute, don't... What was it? Cry. It's okay, Max boy. My Max, my little guy. Sandals she could step into, because otherwise she'd have to tie laces, and... Just a minute. Such a tiny and desolate sound. It was so hard to believe, sometimes, that he was human, and not some other sort of creature. So enormous were his eyes, and his head, and his little thin arms and legs braided across his body as though he was still enwombed. Handbag? No. Phone? Yes. No. Keys? Max, my sweet boy. My dear, please. And something else. She need... Baby, don't cry. I'm right here. It her phone. She grabbed the landline and let it ring until she heard it through the basement door, where a faint light shone through the cracks, and please, please, Max, please. Gaps in the lower wall let daylight arrows through the underground dust. Please don't cry. She opened. Please, 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 I can't think, please. The bedroom door, and her ears rang with a sudden, miraculous silence. Her first numb thought, is he dead? But his chest still rose and fell. She paused on the threshold, rehearsing all the things that happened to newborns left alone in car seats. Then she thought of unpacking him and taking him downstairs, and, no, don't be crazy hypervigilant, he's fine. The ringing. She descended to find her phone on the floor beside the washer. The light was its screen, and she wondered how she hadn't noticed it falling out of her pocket. As she touched the phone, two things happened. Max woke up with a shrill and terrified scream she had not yet heard from him. At the same time, the door at the top of the stairs began to close, and she could not say where the belief came from. She knew she must reach daylight before it shut, or something would happen down here in the dust. Her skin electrified, her heart accelerating, she sprinted up the stairs. Max screamed, and she wondered why they didn't do something about it, and then she corrected herself. Of course they were out, meeting clients. Greg would have rescheduled if he could, he said as he left that morning after doing the 5 a.m. diaper and carrying Max to her in bed so she could nurse and half sleep. The two of them drowsy and still, but for the deep, hungry pulls he took on her breast. So Max was alone up there. Poor mite. Poor stranger in the vast and terrible world. So why shouldn't he cry? Abandoned by his mother, who was being swallowed by the prehistoric dark of her own basement, though she sprinted up the stairs. 3 steps from the top, she slapped her hand on the threshold before the latch could catch, and as she looked up, she thought she saw, for a moment, the knob turn. But this could not be, because there wasn't anyone upstairs to turn the knob, so why was she sprinting up the stairs? The front door was open, though, and gusts of hot, wet air blanketed the room, and the AC was running, and that was just irresponsible, and... Please, Max, stop crying. Please, please, I can't think. Dislike spread from the basement to the narrow stairs, to the door itself, and to the gap beneath it that sometimes emitted a glow like fireflies. A shrinking part of her mind recognized the dislike was stupid, but nevertheless it grew. She began to hear the evening song of a nighttime cicada, in addition to the sudden fade of fireflies clustered in her peripheral as she loaded the washing machine, insects whose lights drew mates or prey. That felt like something she could safely tell Greg. "There's a cicada in the basement," she said, coherent after 3 hours of uninterrupted sleep before the 3 a.m. feeding. She was sitting up in bed, Max in her lap. After a moment, Greg woke and said, "What?" "In the basement. A cicada." "Cicadas don't live in basements," he said. Cicadas live in gardens, not houses. I heard one singing. It sounded exactly like evening. You are probably dreaming, he said. I mean, like how you dreamed there was someone upstairs with me. But there's never anyone upstairs with me. When did I dream that? But Greg was asleep again. Hallucinations, the public health nurse had told her, can actually be a side effect of sleeplessness, hun. Don't be afraid, but don't keep it secret either. Talk to Greg about it if it happens. Ask for help, hun. Talk to Greg, sure, hun, she had thought at the time. And the public health nurse had looked at her carefully and said, Promise me you'll talk to someone about it if it happens. That sounded like a trap. One should never admit to hallucinations, Jenny was pretty sure, when one had a newborn. She lectured herself on what correct behavior looked like. Carry on as though you know the high song of the cicada and the luminous and deadly glow of hunting fireflies aren't there, because they probably aren't. They're just artifacts of an exhausted body. Ignore the third person in the house, though you have heard her step and seen her descend the stairs behind Greg. Ignore the fact that she hears Greg say her name, Jennifer. And who is he talking to? Has he told on her? In the basement, arms full of clean diapers, she saw the not-real thing move parallel with her. Oh, God, was it person-shaped now? It hadn't been person-shaped before. Adrenaline flood, and a new burst of speed on the stairs, and she reached the door just as she glanced toward the light, unintended, and saw, yes, a figure racing also toward the door. But she was faster. She was faster than the yellow-green glide of it, whatever it was. What's worse for your future as a mother with a history of SSRIs and depression or anxiety? To hallucinate a figure in the basement? Or for there to actually be a figure in the basement? Slam the door. Max, still asleep in the blessed normalcy of a Tuesday afternoon. When Greg asks how you are, nod and nod and nod, because he's already worried that you're crazy with love and sleep deprivation. Incidents accumulated. She found her keys on a rock on the far side of the basement. She found a cicada's exuvia in her sock drawer. More footsteps upstairs from the two of them, but there weren't two of them, there was only one. Just Greg. And she had to confirm that fact repeatedly lest she slip and say, You two were pacing a lot today. Are you guys worried about something? And Jennifer, spoken in low tones, like a secret. The public health nurse had said there were things to watch for, like emotional liability and a feeling of disconnection from the child, but that was not the case. The public health nurse had told stories about women so exhausted, hun, by the bottomless, unforgiving need of the newborn, who asks all and gives nothing, that they disintegrated. That was silly, though, since Max gave everything in the weight of his strong little body in her arms, the comfort he found in her skin. The public health nurse never suggested other possible problems, like doors that rattled unaccountably and too many footsteps overhead. So if you're thinking of things to hide from your husband, consider hiding this. First, she was in the hospital waiting for the next contraction, which, despite the epidural, still surfaced into pain, and she thought, I won't survive it. Not this one. She tried to tell them this, but they only encouraged her to breathe. Just breathe through it. And she was hung with drips and needles, and Max was far away, in a glass box under a heat lamp, and she wasn't allowed to touch him because the doctor said, Stop, madam. Don't you know what you are? Don't you know what you could do to him? He asked. Do you know what polar bears do to their young in times of stress? Is this not a time of stress, hun? She struggled up, her breasts full and aching. Greg was out. The third was upstairs, useless, waiting for something, but who knew what? And Max was crying, but his voice was muffled as though by shut doors. And as she stood, she realized the sound was coming from the basement. She threw open the door and pelted down the stairs. He was lying on the floor, unblanketed, and around him the cicadas sang and the daytime fireflies lit and darkened and lit again. But what flickered between them? What shadow intervened? No moment lost, she picked him up and he fit close to her, resting his cheek against her breast. And then, afraid as she was, she decided that Max would not be got, not by monsters, nor the green glow of the fireflies, not by any of it. It wasn't until wakefulness arrived, halfway through a diaper change, as she washed his little face and dressed him in clean clothes, that she considered it was the first time she had moved Max. "Everything okay while I was gone?" Greg asked, his keys dropping in the dish, his shoes off. Max asleep across her chest where she sat, too far from lamps to turn them on, thinking of a twilit firefly world. "Yes." Say it calmly, like it's true. "You sure?" Sure. Smile, because why would anything be wrong? Greg sat on the footstool beside her. He did not turn on the lights, which was good of him. "Because we should think about how things are going, about whether you need to talk to someone." "I'm talking to you." "Because there's nothing to be ashamed of." She said nothing. "If you need to talk to someone, that's what the public health nurse said, right?" "You know what they'll do, Jenny, if they find out about you. You must be very careful to not talk about how you found your son in the basement, crying, and you don't know how he got there, which is why you are very careful not to let on about the third person, the one you hear sometimes moving around upstairs, which is why you are careful to remember what the right words are." "I'm fine, Greg. I'm better than fine. I'm so happy to have him." Greg just looked at her, and she asked herself, "What would a regular type person say?" She added, "But I should probably sleep more." But what was that? There, in the corner of her eye, rising through the dark? What coalesced in black, betrayed only by a flicker at the curtain's edge where light seeped in from the street? A woman, her hair drifting, her feet dragging in the air. One blink and she formed. Another blink, there by the window. There by the bed. There a hand. There, reaching toward Max, who in his sleep still braided his arms and legs across his body. Launched Jenny from the bed. So she brushed the shadow hand of the thing as it, she, bent over the bassinet where he was breathing his sweet, milky breath, so deeply asleep he might have returned to that familiar and original darkness within her body. She lifted him and ran for the door. She might also have been screaming. Her throat felt like it, but she couldn't tell yet. She felt the cold on her back, damp like a basement in summer. She collided with Greg, who stood in the bedroom doorway, and struggled against him, her arms wrapped around Max, who was weighty with sleep in her arms, his silky head knocking against her collarbone where she held him. She could hear him breathing, feel his warmth against her chest and belly, and she felt, against her back, the cold dark of the room from which she fled. Get out. It might already be too late. She staggered. She heard a woman scream. Toward the street, away from the back bedroom and its overhung alleyway of darkness, where branches were fingers and leaves were hands, and the quick skittering rats occupied their muddy kingdoms, running from basement to basement and over the garbage of recycling day. But Greg's arm barred the door. "Jen! Jen!" The room flooded so bright she was blind. "You're asleep." She would make for the street, through the house and past the door to the basement from which this thing had emerged, she thought. She would stop a car and escape. But as she pushed past Greg to make for the front door, he stopped her, checking her into the wall. And though her arms held Max tightly, Greg was stronger, and she felt Max lifted, then gone. And she wailed again as Greg fled from her to the other side of the room, saying, "He's still asleep. That's insane. He's still asleep." That was wakefulness. I'm sorry. Give him back." "This is why we don't co-sleep," Greg said in a funny, brittle voice. "The way you were screaming, I don't know how he could sleep through that. But he's okay. He's okay." This time remained unspoken. After that, they kept him upstairs, sleeping on the floor beside.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?